Hello and welcome back to Too Young to Grieve. And in today's episode, I want to talk about one of the things that people love to tell you about, especially one of the first things that you might hear in your grief journey. And that is the 5 stages of grief. Now, for any of you who haven't heard that yet, the 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And somehow, without anyone actually saying it out loud, we're sort of led to believe that grief works like a kind of to-do list and a checklist, that we just work through these 5 stages of grief in a specific order, and everyone goes through the same 5 stages at the same linear timeline. You start at stage 1, you move through neatly as you do, and eventually arrive at acceptance, like, all right, we're done now. The 5 stages of grief are done, so I'm done grieving. And if that's ever made you feel like you're grieving wrong, then this episode is going to be the one for you. And you are going to enjoy this episode. Now, today, I want to talk about those 5 stages, what they actually are, what they aren't, and why you might not even experience all of them or any of them in the way that you've told you really should. And to be clear from the start, this isn't going to be a psychology lecture. I'm not going to be waffling on at you about these stages and, how you should feel in them and how these things work and whatever. It's just a real conversation, no timelines, no boxes that you need to tick, and no shoulds. Or you should feel this stage of grief. You should feel it by then. You should be over it by now. It's nothing like that at all. As always, just a real conversation to make you feel a bit more seen and understood in your grief journey. And in particular today, about those 5 stages that a lot of people like to mention. Now, before we dive into that, just a bit of context, because I think it does matter, especially when it comes to these 5 stages of grief. Because the 5 stages of grief actually came from a lady called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And originally, they weren't even about bereavement or loss. They were observations of people facing terminal illness. And over time, they got simplified, then shared online, then turned into diagrams, turned into expectations, into timelines, like I said. And suddenly, people grieving are sat there thinking, why am I angry again? I thought I already did that stage. Why haven't I reached acceptance yet? Am I stuck? Am I going to be stuck in this stage forever? Am I going to be angry forever? And that's where I think the 5 stages of grief goes wrong. Because the stages were never meant to be a checklist, and they were never meant to be linear, and they were never meant to even define your grief. So the fact that these stages get chucked around and people sort of learn about them and hear about them and think, okay, I'm going to go through it 1 stage at a time, and that's how my grief journey is going to be, it makes people a bit confused when potentially they don't even hit that stage, or when they experience a stage for longer or get stuck in it. And that's why I think the 5 stages can make your grief journey a lot more difficult. So let's dive into the stages and what they actually mean, and it might make you feel like, okay, yeah, I've actually felt that one before, and that's fine. It's fine if you felt any of these. It's fine if you haven't felt any of them. It's fine if you felt 1 or 2 of them and not 3 of them. They're just parts of grief that a lot of people will experience, and some people won't experience all of them. Some people will experience a couple. So the first stage, as they like to call it, is denial. And I think that denial gets a bad reputation. People think that denial means pretending that it didn't happen. Walking around saying, no, everything's fine. It's not happened. I'm not going to even believe it. But most of the time, denial looks much quieter than that. It's not you shouting about saying, I don't believe that this happened. It just didn't happen. No chance. Denial can look like different things. It can look like feeling numb. It can look like just going into autopilot, just doing the same thing over and over and just going with the flow. It can even mean functioning better than you expected. And that doesn't mean that you believe that it didn't happen. It just means that you're potentially functioning better than you think you should be at that time. And that happens. It could be saying that you're fine and actually believing it. Because denial isn't being delusional. All it is your nervous system protecting you from information that's too much to process all at once. And here's something very important in regards to that. Denial doesn't always come first. It's not always that stage one. Some people feel everything immediately. Some people never really feel denial at all. And some people experience it months later. But you know what? None of that means that you're doing grief wrong. And I always like to say that if grief had an instruction manual, then denial would be that little buffering screen. Because who knows if it's going to happen or when it's going to happen, and who knows what even goes on in the denial stage. The next stage, anger. Now, anger is one of the most misunderstood stages, I think, when it comes to grief. Because what people think when they hear anger around grief is rage or explosions, punching walls. But for a lot of people, anger can show up in different ways. It can show up as irritability. You know, you find that you're getting a bit more irritated at things that potentially didn't before. It can be frustration. You take your frustration out on things that, you know, potentially you probably shouldn't do. It can be snapping at people that you love because the grief is just building up inside of you, and sometimes it does come out. And it can be getting annoyed at tiny things that, again, wouldn't potentially have felt like that before, but now you do get annoyed at them. That's what anger can be. It doesn't mean you're going to go around punching the walls and things like that. You might feel angry at things like life. You might feel angry at the timing, the world, the fact that people are just living normally and you're dealing with this. And sometimes you might even get angry at yourself. You might be thinking, why am I angry? Why did this happen to me? Why am I behaving like this? And I want you to understand that when it comes to grief, that anger isn't a flaw. All it is that grief with energy. That grief is come with energy behind it. And sometimes it's easier to be angry than to feel sad. Anger gives you something to do with that pain that you're feeling. And again, you don't just graduate from the anger stage. You might feel it years later. You might feel it randomly. But that doesn't mean that you've gone backwards at all. That's just grief for you. Different things can show up at different times, even years later. And if it does, you just have to feel it sometimes. That's the thing with grief. Sometimes the best thing that you can do is just feel those emotions, rather than put them to the side or ignore them or bottle them up. The third stage is bargaining. And this one definitely doesn't get talked about enough. Because bargaining isn't always about deals with God or fate. Sometimes it's quieter and more internal. It sounds like things like "if only I had," for example, or replaying conversations from the past, going over decisions that you potentially think you should have made or you should have done, or wondering if something could have changed. And all that is bargaining is the mind basically trying to regain control in a situation where there is none. And I want to say this clearly to you. Bargaining doesn't mean you're stuck. It doesn't mean you're in denial. It just means that you cared. It means that you loved. It means that you felt very deeply about the person that you've lost. And if you've ever gone over the what ifs, that's not weakness. That's love trying to make sense of the loss. And that's all that bargaining is. And I want you to understand those things. The fourth stage is depression. Now, obviously a word like that it's a stage that people fear the most. But depression and grief isn't always constant sadness or crying all the time. It can look like heaviness, that heavy feeling of grief just sitting there. It can look like exhaustion, the exhaustion of having to deal with that heaviness of grief. It can be withdrawing, withdrawing from you don't fancy going to see your friends because you just don't feel up for it. Or you don't fancy going to this event that you've really been looking forward to, but you just don't feel up for it. It can look like losing interest in things. And for me, personally, I've noticed that a lot, especially recently. Losing interest in things like football, for example. Watching football, I used to love watching Tottenham with my dad. But maybe it's because they're rubbish. But I also lost interest in them when they won the Europa League, when they were doing well. And I think that's just a prime example of losing interest in some things that you potentially had before grief. So if you are potentially losing interest in some things that you really were passionate about before, then I don't want you to feel weird for that. It's just kind of part of that grief process again. And depression can also look like just feeling flat, just feeling like it's taken a lot out of you and you just don't have the energy to deal with a lot of things in life because you just feel flat, because you feel like something so big has been taken from you. And the depression stage of grief, it isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet and it just sits there and you might not even notice it. And I think that this is important because feeling depressed after loss doesn't mean that something is wrong with you. All it means is that something happened to you and there's no timeline for that stage. Because that depression after loss, it can come and go. You can function, you can have good days, but you can still feel it underneath. And needing support here doesn't mean that you're failing. It just means that you're human. And if you're feeling those feelings of depression, those things that I've touched upon, you're not weird for feeling them. And you're not weird for wanting to reach out to someone and tell them that. Because telling someone you feel comfortable with is going to help you out of that slump. Massively. And the final stage, which I think is probably one of the biggest myths of them all, that final stage of grief is acceptance. Now, acceptance does not mean being okay with what happened, because who would be okay with losing someone? It doesn't mean feeling peaceful all the time, because you're not going to. You've lost someone you love. Of course you're not going to be peaceful all the time. Of course you're going to think about them sometimes. Yes, it might get less over the years, but it'll still be there. And it doesn't mean moving on, because you don't move on from grief. That's a myth. No one moves on from grief. Unfortunately, it's just part of our life, but we build around that. And what I think acceptance actually looks like is acknowledging the reality without constantly fighting it. Of course, at the start, it's very hard to do that. But over time, you will just understand the reality that those people are gone, unfortunately. And it's more about learning how to carry that grief rather than think you can just erase it. And I think the biggest thing about acceptance for me is allowing life to continue alongside that loss. You can build around it. It might not feel like it at points, but you can build a life around grief. And I think that's the biggest thing for me around the acceptance stage of it. You can accept what happened, but still hate that it did. You can accept and still miss them deeply, daily. And you can accept and still have days where it hurts. It hurts a lot. Because acceptance doesn't mean that you like it, but it means that you stop arguing with reality. And that's what I think acceptance is. And it's tough. It's not easy at all to accept the grief. But at some point, you will. You will accept it as much as we hate to. Now, the biggest myth that I don't like about these stages is that it almost assumes that grief is linear. And it's not. And this is the part that I really want you to hear, and I really want this to land, is that grief is not a straight line. It's not you go through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. The main thing that I've learned through my grief journey is that grief, as Dean Lewis sung, it comes and goes in waves. It loops, it spirals. You can feel acceptance one day and anger the next. You can feel okay for weeks and then be hit by something random, a song, a memory, a photo. Anniversaries, milestones, they bring things back. But what I want you to understand is that doesn't mean that you're going backwards. All it means is that grief is alive and not static. And that is grief. It really does just come out of nowhere sometimes. And it hits you and you feel it. You could be 5 years into your journey and not really be feeling the grief much. But when it does come, it still hits the same. And that's what I want you to understand with grief. It is not linear. You don't go through stages and then once that last stage is done, it's done. It's just part of the life that we live now. But we do get better at carrying it. That's the main thing. So, when it comes to the stages, what I wish people really knew is that if you've heard of these before, or if this is the first time you're hearing about them, you don't experience all 5 stages of grief. You don't experience all 5 stages in order. You don't fail grief if you don't follow them in order, if you don't experience 1 or 2 of them. And you don't complete grief. It's not a game that you end up completing or finishing the campaign. You don't move on from grief. You just move forward with it. And however that looks for you, however you experience those stages, however you experience 1 or 2 of them, it's valid. If you don't experience some of them, it's valid. So I really wanted to cover this topic today because I actually saw someone talking about the stages of grief, and it just reminded me of this and how, yeah, we don't all experience them. We don't all experience them in a linear fashion, and I don't think that people should expect to go through them all like that, because it puts unrealistic expectations on your grief, and we all grieve differently. So if you've ever looked at the 5 stages of grief and thought, this doesn't look like me, you're not broken. You're human. Because grief doesn't come with rules. It doesn't follow diagrams, and it most definitely does not care about timelines. I tell you that. So remember, if you ever see anything about the stages of grief, or if anyone tells you about the stages of grief, just take it with a pinch of salt, because you might not necessarily experience all of these stages, and you definitely won't necessarily experience them in that order. So, yeah, the 5 stages of grief, it's useful to have an understanding of them, to think, if I am feeling this, okay, that is something that a lot of people do experience. It is those stages that they were talking about. But remember, those stages, the order of those stages, it wasn't even created for people who'd gone through grief and bereavement of loss. And that's a really important thing to consider when it comes to the stages of grief. So I really talked about this today and made this episode just so you don't feel like I did when I didn't go through all the stages and I didn't do them in that order, and I thought there was something wrong with me because I hadn't experienced certain emotions and certain stages, and I thought that until I did, I wouldn't get over this grief or this thing that I was feeling. And I was sort of set out that I had to experience these things at one point, but you don't. You're not necessarily going to experience them all. And that's the main thing that I wanted you to gather from this episode. So I won't ramble on much longer about the stages of grief, but that is what I wanted to cover today. So again, if this episode has helped, please share it with someone who might be early in their grief. They might be getting told about the stages of grief and they're not too sure what's going on, or they might have briefly mentioned it to you that they haven't felt certain things and they're not sure why, and they might be feeling weird in that. And if anyone has ever said that to you, please share this with them so they get a bit more clarity on it and a bit more understanding on the things that come with grief. And if someone thinks they're doing it wrong, they definitely need to hear this. So please share it. If anything resonated with you, please let me know. Subscribe, comment, just let me know how these episodes feel. And if they make you feel more understood, then that means the world to me. So yeah, remember, you're not behind. You're not stuck. You're not doing grief wrong. You're just human. And you're grieving